Alrighty. My name's Ryan Wilhelm. This is podcast 1 of the speech class. Take, who knows, probably supposed to be first take, but yeah, today we're going to be talking about argumentation. And you'd think it would just be like arguing, but there's actually a lot more to it than that. So the reading said, there's a lot of basically underlying assumptions about argumentation, which basically means the hidden stuff that we all can kind of agree on when we argue, even if we don't think about it, which is pretty interesting because I guess I never really thought about arguing this way. I feel like I'm just kind of like the regular person where it's just arguing is arguing. But the first idea about is risk. And when you argue, you're always taking a risk. Not just like the risk of losing the argument, but the risk of actually having to change what you believe. And that can mess up your whole worldview. For example, the reading gave us a situation about believing that conservatives could make bad presidents, or, liberals, Green Party, whatever, could make bad presidents. But if you think that, and then someone can convince you that one of them actually makes a good choice in a foreign policy or something, then you can just keep the old you just can't keep the old belief anymore. You've got to change it or adjust it, and then all your other ideas kind of wobble too. When they talked about this really made a good point with me because I would say I'm a big religion buff, and I love talking to everyone about their religion. And there's been a lot of times where, like, for example, I was talking to Jehovah's Witness, and this guy knew his stuff, all right? And he brought up a couple points that I had not thought of, and I had to kind of go back and, revamp, trying to figure out what I was thinking about. Yeah, whatever. It worked the same. But basically, so it's not really a small thing, but it can feel like part of your identity is being challenged. Like, I've always thought about one way about politics, or I don't know, sports, or even what you put on your pizza, and then someone convinces me otherwise, it would just feel weird. But at the same time, that's also why we argue, because you don't actually know everything, and arguing is the best way to test your ideas. Which would bring me to another point that the reading would made, that arguers don't argue because they know they're right. They argue because they might be wrong, which sounds kind of obvious, but it's actually a big deal. Like, when you put your idea out there and let people attack it, you're saying, okay, prove me wrong if you can. And if you survive that, then your argument's stronger. Another thing I thought was pretty cool about this part was about personhood. Like, when you argue with someone, you're basically respecting them as a person because you're treating them like they have the ability to think and judge for themselves. You're not just trying to manipulate them or like treat them like objects. You're actually recognizing them as an equal in the conversation. And that actually makes you value your own thinking more too. I don't think we usually think of arguing that way, but it's kind of nice. The next big assumption was cooperativeness, and this is the one that sounds kind of funny because arguing usually feels like fighting, but the reading said that, like, deep down, argumentation is cooperative. Like, we all agree to play by the same rules even if we disagree on the ideas. So things like politeness, civility, taking turns, respecting evidence, those are actually shared values even in a heated debate. And I mean, the competitiveness isn't all bad either, because the fact that people want to win makes them come up with their best possible reasons. And in the end, that would help everybody because the strongest arguments get tested. So it's like competition on the surface, but underneath is really cooperation. Kind of like sports. I mean, you could say, same thing. Two teams want to win, but they also agree to play by the rules of the game. And if one team just cheated the whole time, it wouldn't even be a real game. And the last big idea was about particularity, which is a big word, but it basically means that every argument is tied to its own specific situation. Like, you can't just make one formula that explains every single argument forever. Instead, you got to look at the actual case, like who's arguing, what's at stake, the history, the power dynamics, all that. Like, Aristotle said, you need to look at the available means of persuasion in each case. So instead of treating arguments like science experiments where you predict everything, Rhetoric is more about paying attention to the unique details. And this is why rhetorical studies don't always come up with big universal laws. Instead, they study particular cases deeply, like a lawyer building a case or an anthropologist doing a thick description of a culture. You can still notice patterns like, oh, hey, this strategy shows up in a lot of arguments, but it's more about understanding what's happening in that specific situation. So yeah, I guess when you put all this together, argumentation's risky, but also respectful, competitive, and even cooperative and reticular instead of a one-size-fits-all, which is kind of messy, but that's also what makes it human. I guess all in all, the reading just reminded us that the argumentation has two sides: descriptive, meaning how we study how people actually argue, and then normative, meaning the ideals of how we should argue. So even though in real life arguments can get ugly, manipulative, or even violent, the ideal is that argumentation should help us figure out what's reasonable and improve communication. Yeah, arguing it isn't just yelling or trying to win. It's risky, but it's how we learn, respect each other, and test our ideas. Yep, that's the podcast. Enter the exit music. Bye-bye.